She was just a poor maid in the king's palace, living a life of silence, pain, and humiliation. But one day, the cruel king's anger went too far. Before the whole court, he threw her into the pit of hungry dogs. What happened next shocked everyone. Did she survive, or was this the end? To find out, watch till the end, and don't forget to subscribe. The palace of King Oba was a place where power and fear walked side by side. Its tall marble walls and golden gates shone in the sunlight, but behind that beauty hid the cruelty of a man whose heart had long turned to stone. The king ruled with an iron fist, crushing anyone who dared to defy him. To his subjects, he was not just a ruler, but a shadow of terror that crept into their homes and dreams. The people whispered in silence about his temper, his punishments, and his love for watching the weak crumble before his eyes. No one felt this weight more than the palace servants, who were treated as nothing more than disposable tools. Among them was a young maid named Amara, barely 24 years old, who had worked in the palace since she was a child. Her parents had died in poverty, leaving her with no choice but to serve. And from the moment she entered the palace, life became nothing but endless commands, long nights, and the sting of cruelty. She was quiet, humble, and obedient, but deep in her eyes there was always a flicker of strength, something the king did not like, for he hated even the smallest sign of defiance. Every morning, Amara would wake before dawn, sweeping the endless corridors of the palace, carrying water to the upper chambers, and scrubbing the grand floors until her hands bled. She had no voice of her own. Her words never mattered. If she made a mistake, even a small one, the overseers would beat her. If she slowed down, she would be denied food for the night. And yet she endured because she had no other path. The palace, with all its shimmering chandeliers and jeweled decorations, was not a home for her. It was a prison where she was chained by survival. Still, she bore the pain quietly, because somewhere in her heart, she believed that no suffering could last forever. But fate had something far darker waiting for her, a test that would push her beyond the edge of fear itself. King Oba had always despised weakness. In his twisted mind, kindness was a disease and mercy was a flaw. What he enjoyed most was watching pain, watching desperation, watching those below him beg for life while he decided their fate with a smile. And Amara, with her quiet dignity, somehow irritated him more than anyone else. She never looked at him directly, never spoke against him. Yet the fact that she endured his cruelty without breaking made him restless. He wanted to see her crumble, to see her stripped of the tiny fragments of strength she carried in her silence. The chance came one evening when the king, drunk with power and wine, noticed Amara accidentally drop a golden goblet while serving. The cup rolled across the floor, clattering against the marble, and silence fell over the entire hall. Everyone froze, for they knew the king's temper could explode at the smallest spark. Amara's hands trembled as she bent to pick it up, whispering apology, but the king's laughter echoed in the chamber, a cold, terrifying laughter that promised nothing good. In that moment, Oba decided that the servant girl had to be made an example. His eyes glowed with malice as he declared before the court that her punishment would not be a whipping nor a prison cell, but something far more savage. He would throw her into the pit of his royal dogs, ferocious beasts that had been trained to rip flesh apart on command. The court gasped, but no one dared to speak. Servants bowed their heads lower, guards kept their silence, and nobles pretended to agree. No one would ever defend a mere maid. No one would risk angering the king. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as two guards seized her arms, dragging her toward the courtyard where the pit waited. Her legs felt weak, but her spirit whispered to her not to cry, not to beg, not to give in the satisfaction of seeing her break. The pit of dogs was a place no one wanted to see, for even the thought of it made grown men tremble. These were not ordinary animals. They were starved before they were fed, trained with blood, and raised to kill without hesitation. Many prisoners had met their end in that pit, their screams echoing in the night as the dogs tore them apart. Now it was Amara's turn, and the king was eager to watch her final moments. The entire court gathered around the pit, the nobles whispering, the guards holding their spears, the servants standing in fear of the edges. The dogs barked wildly, their glowing eyes fixed on the approaching figure of the maid, their claws scratched against the ground, their bodies trembling with hunger and rage. And above them all stood King Oba, smiling as if this was his greatest entertainment. He wanted to see Amara beg. He wanted to see her collapse. He wanted to see her vanish into screams. But as she was pushed forward to the edge of the pit, Amara did something no one expected. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not plead for mercy. She simply lifted her face to the sky, her eyes shining with quiet determination, as though she had already accepted her fate. The crowd whispered in shock. Never had they seen someone face the dogs without fear. Even the king paused for a moment, surprised, but quickly masked it with a cruel laugh. With a sharp command, he ordered the guards to throw her in. And so, with the eyes of the court upon her, Amara was shoved into the pit, her body hitting the ground as the dogs leapt forward. The air was filled with growls, teeth flashing in the dim torchlight, claws scraping against a stone. The crowd held its breath. The king leaned forward, waiting for the first scream. But what happened next was something no one could have imagined. The next morning in the grand palace dawned with a deceptive calm, but Amara's heart still carried the thunder of the previous night. The cruel laughter of the king echoed endlessly in her ears, every note of his mockery clinging to her soul like thorns. She had barely slept, her frail body curled up in the corner of the servant quarters, trembling under the weight of dread. Every servant in the palace had heard what the king had declared, that she, a mere maid who had done nothing but serve with humility and obedience, would be thrown to his vicious pack of hounds. The dogs were known across the land, not for their loyalty, but for their merciless hunger, trained to tear apart the flesh of anyone the king commanded. The palace guards whispered of past punishments, the way merchants who dared to cheat in taxes or soldiers who failed to bring victory were tossed into the iron cages, left to the dogs' fangs and fury. But never before had a young woman, a maid whose crime was nothing more than being poor and powerless, been condemned to such a fate. Fear spread among the other servants like wildfire, but fear had no voice in the king's palace. Silence was the only shield they carried, and so they stayed quiet, though their eyes followed Amara with pity, their souls mourning for her as if she was already gone. Amara, however, though shattered inside, walked with her head lowered but not entirely defeated. She had lived with pain her entire life, born into poverty, abandoned by fortune, surviving only through the scraps of work the palace had offered her. She had scrubbed floors until her knees bled, carried water until her arms felt like lead, endured insults until words no longer pierced her heart. Yet this new torment, this certainty of being devoured alive by beasts in front of the sneering king and his court, was unlike anything she had ever imagined. She thought of her mother who had died years ago, her father who had been dragged to war and never returned, and the little brother she had once cradled who had starved in her arms. Life had stolen everything from her, and now it seemed determined to rob her of the only thing left, her dignity, her breath, her right to exist. But beneath her sorrow, somewhere deep, a strange ember began to glow, a whisper inside her heart that told her she must not die the way the king desired, not torn to pieces as entertainment for a tyrant, not reduced to a spectacle of cruelty. That day, as the sun burned over the palace walls, preparations were already underway for the grim event. The king wanted it to be a performance. He demanded that his nobles gather in the courtyard, dressed in their finest robes, that drums and horns be sounded so the whole palace would hear the announcement of judgment. He ordered the iron gate of the dog pit to be polished, the chains of the beasts rattled to sharpen their hunger. Meat was withheld from them the entire night, so that their rage would peak, their jaws snapping in anticipation. The cruel king paced back and forth in his golden sandals, his lips curled in a sinister smile. To him, cruelty was not simply punishment. It was power. By throwing Amara to the dogs, he was not only crushing her, but sending a message to all who lived under his command. Defy him, anger him, displease him even in the smallest way, and you would end the same. This was his theater of fear, and Amara was meant to be its sacrifice. As the time drew closer, Amara found herself surrounded by guards, their spears glinting in the sun, their eyes cold and devoid of mercy. She was forced to walk across the palace courtyard where nobles had already gathered. Their laughter was sharp, their whispers poisonous, their eyes glittering with the cruel delight of people who feasted on another's misery. She heard fragments of their words. She will not last a breath. The dogs will shred her like paper. How foolish to have crossed a king! Every sound felt like a blade slicing deeper into her spirit. Yet she kept her head bowed, her lips pressed tightly together, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. Somewhere in the crowd, a few servants huddled, their faces pale with helpless grief, but none dared to speak. Amara's life, it seemed, was already measured and dismissed by the powerful. When the moment came, the air itself seemed to freeze. The courtyard grew silent as the king rose from his jeweled throne at the far end. His robe shimmered with gold thread, his crown heavy on his head, and his smile was wide, a mask of satisfaction. He raised his hand, and in a booming voice that echoed off the palace walls, he declared Amara guilty of disobedience and disrespect, though she had done nothing to deserve such a judgment. He announced that her punishment would serve as a lesson to all who served beneath him. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he gestured toward the iron pit where the dogs were locked. A guard seized Amara by the arm, dragging her forward as the nobles clapped and laughed, some even tossing coins at her feet as if wagering how long she would survive. The pit door creaked open, and the sound of snarling filled the air, low and menacing, like the very breath of death itself. Inside the cage, the dogs stirred, their eyes glowing with hunger, their jaws snapping with restless fury. They were massive creatures, their fur matted, their muscles bulging under their skin, trained killers who knew only the command of violence. The crowd leaned forward, eager, hungry for the sight of flesh being torn apart. The king reclined in his throne, his hands folded in satisfaction, savoring the fear radiating from the young maid. Amara was pushed to her knees before the pit, the stench of the beasts washing over her. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let silence fill her. She thought of the days she had carried scraps of food to the kennels, how sometimes, against the rules, she had fed the dogs when no one was watching. She remembered their eyes then not as monsters, but as creatures desperate, starving, abandoned by the same cruelty that ruled over her life. She had felt pity, and so she had given them bread, bits of meat, even her own meal when she had nothing else. And as the guard shoved her forward, she felt a strange certainty settle over her chest. Perhaps the dogs had not forgotten. The iron gate swung open with a thunderous clang, and Amara was thrown inside. The crowd roared, the king's laughter rising above them all. The beasts lunged forward, their teeth flashing, their growls shaking the air. The moment stretched like eternity, the world holding its breath to watch her be torn apart. But then, something unexpected happened, something that froze the entire courtyard into stunned silence. The dogs stopped. They circled her, their growls rumbling low. But instead of attacking, they sniffed the air, their memories recognizing the scent of the one who had once fed them when hunger burned their bellies. One by one, their fury dimmed. Their jaws did not snap at her throat. Instead, the largest of them sat down, its eyes locking on her with something that looked almost like loyalty. The nobles gasped, murmurs spreading like ripples through the crowd. The king's smile faltered, his face tightening with disbelief. Amara, trembling but unbroken, looked up slowly, her eyes meeting the king's in a moment that burned with defiance. She was not dead. The beasts had chosen not to devour her, and for the first time, the cruel king felt the trembling edge of humiliation. The heavy iron gates of the royal arena clanged shut, and the sound echoed like a death sentence inside the vast stone walls. The crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle leaned forward in anticipation, their eyes shining with cruel curiosity, waiting for the moment the poor servant girl would be torn apart by the savage beasts. The king, seated upon his golden throne, wore a smug expression, his jeweled fingers tapping impatiently against the armrest. He had orchestrated this moment for no reason other than to satisfy his own twisted hunger for dominance. To him, she was just a servant, a disposable life, a mere object that could be discarded for entertainment. He relished the gasp of the spectators, the rising roar of excitement that filled the arena, and a look of pure terror etched upon the young woman's trembling face as the cage at the far end rattled violently. Behind those iron bars were not one but 3 dogs, massive, snarling beasts with eyes that glowed red in the flickering torchlight, their sharp fangs glistening with saliva, their chains straining with every movement as they lunged forward, desperate for release. Amara, the servant, fell to her knees in the sand of the arena floor, her body trembling under the crushing weight of fear. The air smelled of rust and blood, the very ground beneath her bearing the stains of countless others who had met their end in this same dreadful pit. She wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but her voice caught in her throat. She thought her mother's face, the only warm memory she carried within her heart, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. This was not supposed to be her fate. She was only 24, a girl with dreams too fragile to survive in a palace of cruelty. She had lived her life in silence, scrubbing the marble floors, washing the king's garments, carrying trays of food with her head bowed, hoping never to be noticed. But fate had been unkind, and one mistake, a tray dropped, a dish broken, had turned her into prey for the king's merciless game. Now, the punishment was before her. She was to become a meal for the royal hounds. The king rose to his feet, lifting a jeweled scepter high above his head as the crowd cheered in unison. His voice boomed across the arena, dripping with arrogance. Behold the fate of disobedience. This servant dared to defy her king, and now she will be devoured by the beasts who know no mercy. The crowd erupted, their cheers a mixture of fear and thrill, for no one dared to oppose the king. The iron gate creaked open, the grinding of metal against stone piercing through the silence like the sound of doom. Slowly, the first of the dogs emerged, a massive black beast with scars carved into its body, evidence of countless battles. Its growl reverberated through the arena, its nose sniffing the air hungrily as it fixed its gaze on the trembling figure before it. The second and third followed, equally monstrous, their low snarls echoing like thunder as they spread across the sand, circling Amara like predators closing in on a fragile piece of prey. Amara's heart pounded in her chest so violently she thought it might burst. The heat of their breath reached her as the dogs drew nearer, saliva dripping from their jaws, their eyes locked on her every movement. She stumbled backward, her hands pressing against the sand as her legs shook violently beneath her. The crowd chanted louder and louder, their voices a deafening wave urging the beast to strike. The king leaned forward, his grin widening, his eyes glittering with the sick delight of man who had forgotten what it meant to be human. For him, this was justice. For her, this was the end. But in that suffocating moment of fear, something remarkable happened. Something no one in the arena expected. The first dog, the largest of them all, stopped in its tracks. Its nostrils flared as it sniffed the air, its head tilting slightly as though recognizing something familiar. Its growl softened into a low whine, and it lowered its head, staring at Amara with something that looked less like hunger and more like recognition. The second and third dogs slowed as well, their tense postures easing ever so slightly as their eyes darted between the girl and their leader. Confusion rippled through the crowd. The jeers turned to murmurs. The king's smug expression faltered for the first time, his fingers tightening around the scepter. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. Amara, trembling, dared to raise her head. Her wide eyes met the gaze of the black beast, and in that instant she understood. These were the very dogs she had fed scraps of food to in the palace courtyard, night after night, when no one was watching. They had been chained, starved, and neglected by the king's men, left to fight for scraps in the dirt. But Amara, with her quiet kindness, had always saved a portion of her own meager meal, sneaking into the hungry beasts when no one noticed. She had whispered soft words to them, her only companions in a world that offered her no love. She had not thought much of it then, only that her heart would not allow her to see another creature suffer. And now, in the arena where her life was to end, that simple kindness returned to her in the most unexpected way. The dogs circled her still, but their growls softened into whines, their eyes wide with recognition. The leader approached, its massive paws pressing into the sand, its head lowering closer to hers. Amara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the strike. But instead, she felt the warmth of the dog's breath against her face, followed by a low, mournful sound. The beast pressed its snout gently against her arm, as though reassuring her. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The other two dogs followed, sniffing and whining, nudging her with their muzzles, their tails twitching ever so slightly. The arena fell into stunned silence. The people leaned forward, their eyes wide, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The king shot to his feet, his face twisting with rage, his voice booming. "No! Tear her apart. Obey your master." He raised the scepter high, shouting commands, but the dogs ignored him completely. Their loyalty was not his. It belonged to the servant who had shown them compassion when no one else did. For the first time, the king realized that his power did not extend as far as he believed. His beasts, the very weapons he'd used to instill fear, had turned their allegiance elsewhere. The silence of the arena turned into murmurs, and then into a growing wave of whispers that spread like wildfire. People exchanged looks, some with awe, some with fear. They had never seen anyone defy the king, not even his dogs. Amara, her body still shaking, reached out a trembling hand and stroked the head of the black beast. The dog closed its eyes, leaning into her touch, its body relaxing as though soothed by her presence. She felt tears stream down her cheeks, not of fear this time, but of relief and something deeper. In that moment, she realized that kindness had power greater than cruelty, and even in the darkest places, compassion could light a fire no tyrant could extinguish. She looked up at the king, her eyes burning with a newfound strength, and for the first time, he felt the ground beneath his feet shift. The crowd no longer cheered for him. They cheered for her. And as the dogs surrounded Amara not as predators but as protectors, standing firmly by her side, the king's control began to crumble like sand slipping through his fingers. The night after the spectacle was the longest night of Amara's life. She sat in the small, windowless chamber the guards had locked her in, her heart pounding, her mind replaying every moment of the arena. She could still hear the bloodthirsty growls of the dogs circling her, feel their hot breath on her trembling skin, and smell the dust mixed with fear that hung in the air like a curse. And yet, miraculously, she had survived. The same dogs that had been unleashed to rip her apart had hesitated, confused by something deep inside her presence, something that even she could not explain. For a moment they had recognized her, not as prey, but as a being who had once fed them scraps behind the palace kitchens, a being whose trembling hands had pushed bowls of leftovers toward their cages when no one else bothered. That faint recognition had saved her, but now, locked in the silence of her dark chamber, she knew this mercy would not last forever. The king was furious. The people had seen a crack in his cruelty, and men like him never tolerated weakness. Tomorrow, she feared, he would find another way to end her. The king himself did not sleep that night. In his lavish chambers, with torches flickering against golden walls and silk curtains swaying with the night breeze, he sat restless on his bed, his face twisted in anger. How dare the dogs defy him? How dare a servant girl steal the spectacle from his hands? For years he had ruled with fear, feeding the crowd's hunger for blood and punishment. But this time, instead of cheers, he had heard whispers. Whispers that maybe the king was losing his touch. Whispers that maybe the gods themselves had intervened. And nothing terrified a tyrant more than the sound of his people's doubt. Pacing across the room, his heavy robe dragging against the floor, he clenched his fists and swore to himself that Amara would not leave this palace alive. She would not become a symbol of defiance. He would crush her completely, in a way so humiliating, so final, that no one would ever dare to speak her name again. But in the shadows of the palace, beyond the glittering halls where the king strutted, other hearts were stirring. Servants whispered to one another in hushed tones, their voices trembling with both fear and hope. They had all seen what happened in the arena. They had all seen how the girl, one of their own, had stood in the circle of death and lived. Many of them remembered her kindness, the way she shared food when others went hungry, the way her quiet eyes always held compassion even in the darkest hours. For the first time, they began to believe that maybe the cruelty of the king could be challenged. Maybe the gods had chosen her. And as the night dragged on, a quiet wave of courage began to ripple through the hidden corners of the palace. Amara's cell door creaked open in the deep hours of the night, and a dim lantern spilled light into the suffocating darkness. She lifted her head, eyes wide, heart pounding with dread that the guards had come to drag her to her end. But instead, it was not the harsh voice of a soldier she heard. It was the trembling whisper of a young servant boy. "Amara," he breathed, his eyes darting nervously down the hallway. "You must not give up. The king is planning something worse for you tomorrow. But you are not alone. We have seen the truth. We will help you." For a moment Amara could not speak. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She had lived her whole life unseen, voiceless, powerless. And now, in the darkest hour, there was someone standing in front of her, risking everything to give her a chance. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded silently, a fragile spark of strength flickering to life in her chest. The next day dawned with heavy clouds hanging low over the palace, as though the heavens themselves disapproved of the cruelty about to unfold. The arena was once again filled with people, their faces eager yet uneasy. The story of the dogs had already spread beyond the palace walls, carried on the lips of traders and travelers, whispered in the markets, discussed in the streets. Some came to see her end, others came out of disbelief, and many came with secret, dangerous hope that perhaps this girl was more than just a servant, that perhaps her survival was a sign that the tyrant could be defeated. The king sat high upon his throne, his face masked with a cruel smile, though beneath it his jaw was tight with rage. He raised his hand, and the drums thundered, summoning silence from the crowd. Then he stood, his voice booming through the air like a weapon. Yesterday the girl defied death. Today she shall meet a fate no one can escape. With that he gestured, and 2 guards dragged Amara into the arena, her wrists bound, her steps slow but steady. This time it was not the dogs that awaited her. A deep pit had been dug in the center of the arena, its edges jagged, its depth hidden by shadows. Around it, stakes as sharpened wood jutted out like hungry teeth. The king leaned forward, his cruel eyes gleaming as he declared, "Today she will be thrown into the pit, and not even the gods will save her." Gasps rippled through the crowd, some out of shock, others out of outrage. The servants watching from the edges exchanged glances, their hearts hammering. They knew this was their moment. They had made their plan in the secrecy of the night, and they would not let it fail. As the guards forced Amara toward the pit, something extraordinary happened. From the far corner of the arena, the dogs that had once been her executioners began to howl. Their cries pierced the sky, raw and wild, sending shivers down the spines of all who heard. They strained against their chains, pulling with desperate strength, their eyes locked on the girl who had once fed them. The crowd erupted in chaos, some shouting in fear, others in awe, as the chains snapped one by one under the force of the animal's fury. In an instant, the dogs were free, charging not toward Amara, but toward the guards who held her. The soldiers panicked, stumbling backward as the animals lunged, their growls echoing through the arena like thunder. Amara fell to her knees, breathless, as the crowd roared in disbelief. The dogs circled her again, but just as before, they did not harm her. Instead, they stood between her and the soldiers, their bodies forming a shield of snarling defiance. The king's face went pale, his hand trembling on the arm of his throne. For the first time in his reign, he felt something he had never known before, fear. Not fear of the gods, not fear of his enemies, but fear of a servant girl who had become something more. He leapt to his feet, shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the crowd, a roar that no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. The great hall of the palace was filled with silence so heavy that it seemed to choke the very air out of the stone walls. The torches flickered against the cold marble pillars, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the floor where the poor maid now stood, her body weak but her spirit burning brighter than ever. Around her, nobles and guards whispered nervously, their eyes darting from her trembling figure to the throne where the cruel king sat, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. He had tried everything, beating her, humiliating her, and finally unleashing his pack of savage dogs on her. But every attempt had failed. The very beasts he had raised to kill had turned against him, choosing loyalty to the girl who had once fed them scraps in secret. Now the kingdom was watching, and for the first time, fear glimmered in the king's eyes. His power, once unquestioned, was crumbling before the courage of a servant girl. The maid, her clothes torn and face bruised, stood taller than she ever had before. She looked not like a broken slave, but like a figure of strength molded by suffering. The crowd could see it. The transformation was undeniable. Even the guards who once obeyed the king without question now hesitated, their hands lingering uncertainly on their weapons, as if they weren't sure who the true enemy was anymore. The king's cruel laughter, which once sent shivers down spines, now sounded desperate, hollow, forced. "Do you think you can defeat me?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls. "You are nothing but dirt beneath my feet. A servant, a woman who was born to serve and die without honor." But his words, meant to terrify, only revealed his fear. The maid's silence in return was louder than his roar, and her steady gaze pierced him like a blade, making him shift uneasily on his throne. In a final act of arrogance, the king ordered the dogs once more. He clapped his hands, and the iron gates swung open, releasing the snarling hounds. Their eyes glowed in the firelight, their fangs glistening as they bounded forward. But when they reached the maid, they stopped. They did not attack. They circled her protectively, growling, not at her, but at him. The crowd gasped in shock as the dogs, creatures bred for cruelty, turned their fangs toward their master. The king's face drained of color as he realized the betrayal. He tried to command them, screaming their names, but they only bared their teeth, their loyalty bound not to him, but to the kindness they had known in the hands of the servant he despised. The tables had turned, and everyone knew it. The mighty king, who had ruled through terror, was suddenly the hunted, his throne no longer a shield but a cage closing in around him. The moment of reckoning came swiftly. The dogs lunged at him, not with the blind savagery he had taught them, but with precise fury, as though they knew exactly who deserved their wrath. The once proud ruler stumbled back, his crown slipping from his head, his robe tearing as he fell to the cold stone floor. His screams echoed in the chamber, but no one moved to help him. Not one guard, not one noble, not even the servants he had enslaved for years. They all stood frozen, watching justice unfold in its most primal form. The king's power ended not with a battle, not with a rebellion, but with the consequences of his own cruelty turning against him. The maid stood motionless, her heart pounding, as she witnessed the downfall of the man who had made her life a prison. She had not lifted a finger against him, yet her courage had been the spark that set his destruction in motion. When the chaos subsided, the throne room was silent once more. The king lay still on the floor, broken not only in body but in the spirit of fear he had ruled with. The dogs, their duty fulfilled, sat quietly at the maid's feet, their heads bowed as if waiting for her command. Slowly, the nobles began to kneel, not to the fallen king, but to her. One by one, they bent their heads, acknowledging the strength she had shown. For years they had watched silently as cruelty reigned, but in this moment, they saw where true power lay, not in crowns or thrones, but in compassion, in courage, in the quiet strength of a girl who had once been invisible. The maid, trembling, did not smile or celebrate. Instead, tears rolled down her face as she realized what had happened. She had survived. She had endured. And without intending to, she had become the symbol of change in a kingdom long ruled by fear. But power was never what she sought. She did not climb the throne or claim the crown. Instead, she walked past it, her footsteps echoing with finality as she left behind the seat of cruelty. The crowd parted for her, not out of fear but out of respect. They whispered her name. Their voices carried her story to the palace halls and into the streets beyond. A servant girl had done what no soldier, no noble, no rival king had ever achieved. She had brought the tyrant to his knees. The people outside, when they heard the tale, would no longer bow to the memory of a cruel ruler, but would remember the day when a maid's courage changed everything. Her legacy would not be written in blood or gold, but in the hope she ignited in others who had once believed themselves powerless. As she stepped into the cool night air, the stars above seemed brighter, as if the heavens themselves had witnessed the fall of tyranny. The city, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed vast, open, full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to dream. The dogs followed her silently, no longer beasts of terror, but companions in her new journey. She did not know where the path would lead, but for the first time in her life, she was free. And freedom, she realized, was worth every scar she carried. The story of the maid and the dogs would be told for generations, not as a tale of magic or miracle, but as a reminder that kindness, even in the smallest acts, could topple the greatest cruelty. The mighty king had fallen, and the servant girl had risen, not by becoming like him, but by staying true to herself. And now, dear viewers, if the story of courage, resilience, and the downfall of cruelty touched your heart, then don't let it end here. Support stories like these, where the unheard finally find their voice and the powerless rise against the powerful. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale that reminds us all of the strength hidden in even the most overlooked souls. Your support keeps these stories alive, and together, we can keep shining a light on the courage that exists even in the darkest of times.